Welcome to this video tutorial with Virtual Racing School for the GTE class of the IMSA Sports Car Championship on iRacing. This week we're at Imola, where I'll be looking at a lap by Rens Broekman with the Ferrari 488 GTE, for which he's driven in default afternoon weather to match the official series. I'll play the lap in full for you first before then going into further analysis. Okay, so that was a 1 minute 39.894. Starting off then from the list of data packs on the VRS app, we're going to scroll down and choose the Ferrari data pack as driven by Rens Broekman for the IMSA series. It's week 12, so I'm going to choose that. This will load the session details, where of course you can view the stint data, you can download the setup file. I'm just going to click on Learn Track to open the driving analyzer, and it'll start to play the lap through. I'm just going to pause it and show you what you can see here. You've got a steering angle input trace, you've got the speed of the car, brake and throttle inputs, and live driving inputs as well. So I'm just going to slow this down and mute it so you can hear me. Just going to play this through. Obviously you want to be keeping the car relatively far to the left. This is sort of a corner, that's technically turn 1, and obviously this is going to be the apex that you want to take. Run the car out towards the outside as you approach turn 1, and look for your braking reference, which is going to be dictated by these markers on the right. Now it's well after the 200 marker, it's also well before the 100 marker, but you can use this access road on the right hand side, which is pretty much just after where Rens begins braking, and it's quite a heavy braking zone this. You're carrying lots of speed, and notice that Rens doesn't actually have the car all the way to the right hand edge here. The reason being is the circuit kinks slightly to the left just after he starts braking, so he wants to basically brake in a straight line, which will take him to the outside edge by the time he turns in. And obviously it's quite a heavy braking zone, as I said, so we're going to peak at around 60% braking there, bleeding off ever so slightly as the downforce drops away, because you don't want to lock up. And then I'll just play this through. So by the time Rens reaches the turn-in point, the car is fully over to the edge of the circuit, as I said, and then you're just basically setting up the line of the car to position yourself for a good exit. So you want to maintain a good tight line through the first apex, so that you're not too narrow or too wide, or rather too tight into the entry for what is turn 3. So play this through, and you can actually use a bit more curve than this here. You can probably get away with a little bit more. and you can see here just how much more curb Rens is able to get away with. You can actually just about clip these anti-cut curbs in a few places. This is one of them. Just be aware that they can be very aggressive, and you will need to feather the throttle as you do so. And notice that when Rens came off the brakes initially into turn 1, there was no coasting, so just a little bit of trail braking all the way into the apex to keep the car rotating nicely. And he also picked up the throttle quite aggressively initially as well. I'll just go back there to show you that. So right on the apex does he pick up the throttle. He feathers as he rides this curb through the right-hander so that he doesn't run too wide and compromise his exit through the final left of 4. And because of that line, he's able to easily take this flat out. So it's just about taking the minimum steering angle to carry the maximum speed so it doesn't scrub off too much. Into the fast chicane of 5 and 6 now. This is very much about braking fairly early and gently and conserving momentum, carrying speed, especially through this first part. So you can see here that Rens brakes quite early, well before the 50 marker. He bleeds off the brakes really nicely, especially so because he's turning in quite early here. This first corner has quite an early turn in. He's already started turning in pretty much immediately as he's on the brakes. Down into third gear, using a lot of this curb on the left, really cutting that anti-cut curb there. Gets away with it in this car that rides the curbs quite nicely. A little bit of coasting as well there actually, but that's mainly because the car he doesn't want to unsettle the car off that curb. So he keeps the car fairly tight, which opens up the following right-hander where he does have a short brake input before turning in, and then trail braking all the way into the apex. And again, apexes really nicely. So both those apex curbs he was actually quite aggressive with. And you actually see on the exit here that Rens is quite smooth and progressive with his throttle input, but doesn't commit to full throttle because he's not sure about the stability of the car through the exit here. And the fastest way through here is to really carry the momentum, which will force the car out wide onto this wide and flat exit curb, which can be quite aggressive if you overdo it, hence why he was just feathering the throttle there. So bring the car back over to the right hand side. Now there's a few different lines that you can use into this hairpin. I personally prefer a fairly tight entry line, but you'll see here that Rens, who by the way brakes again just at this access road on the right hand side just there. There's also the 50 marker that you can use as a reference, but you'll see here that Rens actually leaves the car quite wide on entry, gets a really good exit, but has to sacrifice a bit of entry speed as a result. So I personally prefer to take an earlier apex at the cost of a slight bit of exit speed, but it really depends. If you're trying to defend your position, then my line would work better. If you're trying to overtake someone, then for sure Rens's line is going to give you a better exit and a potential opportunity into turn 8. So you can see here a fairly late apex for Rens, picks up the throttle as ever as he apexes, and initially is quite careful with the throttle, presumably because of this curb usage, and it's also very easy to lose the rear end and lose traction and get a bad exit even with that late apex just by being too aggressive on the throttle. And you can actually see, despite the careful throttle application, that Rens does get a little bit of oversteer visible in the steering trace through the exits. You can run wide onto the AstroTurf here, but it does lose you traction slightly, so again Rens chooses to stay on the tarmac there. Keep the car over to the right hand side, up the hill towards turn 8. Just going to skip forward to the next sector here, and you've got this brake marker here, 50 meters, which is going to be when Rens hits the brakes quite hard on the brakes initially before turning in fairly early on and bleeding off fairly early on as well, pretty much in tandem with how he turns in, just again avoiding locking up. And again we notice here no coasting, just a tiny little bit of trail braking just to keep the front end loaded up. Just allows him to come off the brake a bit sooner and carry that entry speed in here, which we see into the apex. So apexes really nicely, and again picks up the throttle as he apexes really nicely. Through the exit, you've got a similar situation with AstroTurf if you run too wide, and you can see that as a result of Rens potentially being a bit early on throttle, he's actually having to feather the throttle a bit more than otherwise would be possible with a slightly tighter exit. But still carries good exit momentum and speed downhill into Acqua Minerale, which is a tricky corner, probably the most difficult sequence of corners on the whole circuit. And really the important thing is to, again, maintain momentum through the first part. So similar to the turn 5 and 6 chicane, by braking nice and early but very, very gently to really carry the entry speed in. So down into third gear just before the apex, but by braking so gently he's able to keep the car nice and composed and controlled. But again, if you're going to do this, you can't afford to brake too late, because then you'll potentially unsettle the car. And then as you arrive at the second right-hander, which is much tighter than the first one, you will have to get back on the brakes a bit firmer. And we see that Rens goes down into second gear here. And it's really important, obviously, to keep the car nice and settled. Don't leave your braking too late. Don't run too close to the edge. This is pretty close, I'm not going to lie. But at the same time, you do want to open the corner up as much as possible. So it's a risk and it's a compromise, as pretty much normal, really. But especially here. And you want a decent, clean exit up the hill. You can see here that Rens has apexed really nicely. I would say you probably want to avoid these anti-cut curbs because you want a stable exit up the hill. And we see that Rens is able to pick up the throttle quite cleanly, gets a nice clean exit, and keeps the car quite tight as well. Again, just dropping a wheel onto the AstroTurf, that's fine really, as long as you've got the car and the steering nice and straight, you should easily be able to get away with that. There's a few different lines that you can actually take exiting that corner. If you want to run a bit wider, you want to keep the car straight when you're running the AstroTurf, so potentially you can end up over here, which is fine. But Rens obviously keeps the car nice and tight as he approaches the tricky and slow turn 11 and 10 chicane, where it's important to take quite a lot of curb, and you're really going to see this here. Now, I would actually argue by the shape of Rens's brake trace here that he brakes just a bit too early because he's really gentle on the brakes. And he picks up the brake pressure until threshold about halfway into the braking zone. I'll just play this through. A fairly early turn in considering the tightness of the chicane, and the reason for that is, as we're going to see, you can really muller these curbs, you can really attack them. So he's got the entire car over the aggressive part of the chicane there, and is still braking into the second half and takes a little bit less of the second chicane, or the second apex I should say. So we take it back on board, and that allows a slightly cleaner exit than otherwise. Potentially you can use more curb, but the car will be unsettled, so you might actually carry more apex speed but potentially less exit speed. So again, it's a compromise. But he picks up the throttle really nice and early as a result of being more conservative with that second curb, and is able to keep a nice clean line through the exits. Does drop some wheels onto the AstroTurf. You can actually be quite aggressive in your track usage here before you will eventually be penalised. And then down the hill then towards the right-hander of turn 13. I'm just going to skip forward a little bit. You want to keep the car over to the left-hand side just to open up the right-hander, which should be easily flat out. Just be aware of your line down the hill. And you want to position the car over to the right hand side of the track before you start braking. And again, there's a 100 meter marker here that you can use as a brake reference, which is pretty much when Rens brakes. So it's downhill, so you can't brake too hard, otherwise you risk locking up. A fairly late turn in, and we see that Rens doesn't actually use much of the entry curb there. In fact, he's slightly off the apex, Now that will cost him a slight bit of time, but it's not too significant because the most important part of this 13 to 15 sequence, so this is 14 that we're in now, is about getting your exit really nice through 15. So we'll just play this through as Rens comes off the brake. A little bit of oversteer there that we can see in the steering trace, and he picks up the throttle a little bit late, but the important thing to note is he's carried good speed in here, and the exit curb here is really flat and really wide, so you can really take advantage of it. He's got the entire car past the white line there, but you can get away with that without penalty. And then a little bit of braking just as he sets himself up before the tarmac change, which you can use as a reference, into the last real corner on the circuit. There's actually 16 and 17, but that's basically a straight. So it's really important to carry good speed here, but also get really good exit speed. So you want to be early and gentle on the brakes, have a nice wide entry, and then as you turn in, try and grab this curb on the inside. You could potentially use even more than that actually, and be early and clean on the throttle. So don't be too greedy, don't get on the power, don't get to full throttle too soon, otherwise you risk losing stability, losing traction, and open the track up. This circuit does have very, very forgiving curbs through the exits, despite the AstroTurfs. As long as you've got the car nice and straight, it just keeps the car nice and clean and allows you, or Rens in this case, to carry good exit momentum down the... So this is basically 15 and 16, sorry, 16 and 17, but it's basically flat out to complete the lap. You can find all setups, replays and telemetry for your own use and analysis on virtualracingschool.com, where you can also book coaching, including group classes with world champions from the likes of Koen and SimSport. Good luck for this week, and feel free to post any questions or comments below. Thanks for watching.